because I just want to say one of the things that you probably didn't know back then was that Seattle had the second highest sniper rate in the country.
Mm.
And there was no difference between our chapter and any other chapter around the country. We were the first chapter formed outside of the state of California.
Yeah.
We were very aware of when Jonathan was murdered, because it was a setup, which a lot of people don't know.
Mm.
And I was in prison when George was murdered. And the prison captain came to me and my other comrade that was in there, who was from the Portland chapter, and told us he was going to shoot us first if anything broke out in the prison. So a lot of people don't know the significance of the Seattle chapter. But
Chicago, Chicago, that toddling town, Chicago, Chicago, I'll show you around.
The corner was our magic, our music, our politics. Fires raised as tribal dances and war cries broke out on different corners. Power to the people.
And just say Shop City. If you don't know by now, I'm talking about Shot Town. And just say Shop City, Shop City. Back me like you thought you
Welcome, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Sunnyside podcast. My name is Giziribtah, and I'm here with
Nehez Meniooh.
And we have a very special guest for you today. I am probably the most excited in the room.
You definitely are, and that's even with me being excited.
Yes. We have Mr. Elmer Dixon today, and he is, just a figure in the Black community, figure in the Black Power movement initiative that was spearheaded back in the 1960s. And no one would understand the Black Power movement without understanding the Black Panther Party. They were just a pillar, not only for the liberation of Black people, but for the liberation of humanity, fighting against a colonial power, a colonial influence that infiltrated society on so many levels. And it really took the youth, it really took the push of young people to make a stand, draw a line, and say enough is enough. Surely we had the civil rights movement, we had a lot of different efforts, but the Black Panther Party pushed it to another level. And with that being said, I don't want to take away from Mr. Dixon, and I would allow him to give a proper introduction for himself. So without further ado, I'll ask Mr. Dixon to take the floor at this time.
Welcome, Mr. Dixon. It's so great to have you.
thank you. My pleasure.
Can you just introduce yourself to our viewers, to our listeners? Who are you? Where did you fit into the Black Panther Party? And what are you doing today in continuing that work that was started?
I'm one of the co-founders of the Seattle chapter of the Black Panther Party, which was the first chapter of the Black Panther Party formed outside of the state of California, which is significant.
Yes.
And also the second chapter overall, because the only other chapter at the point when we formed our chapter after meeting Chairman Bobby Seale in San Francisco and then Oakland, the only other chapter that the party had at that time was the Southern California chapter in Los Angeles.
And when you say chapter, because it started in Oakland and then a second chapter started in Southern California?
Oakland was always and has always been known as central headquarters.
Uh-huh.
So central headquarters was not a chapter.
I see.
It was the central headquarters of the Black Panther Party, initially the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense.
Mm-hmm.
It's where our leadership was, the Central Committee. And the first chapter that was formed was the LA chapter, the Southern California chapter, led by Bunchy Carter.
Okay.
So there was just that one chapter connected to central headquarters.
Mm-hmm.
But when we get into the story, I'll tell you how all of that, how all of that began to explode all of a sudden in the spring of 1968.
And before we get into that story, because on the Sunnyside, we often like to, as students of traditional culture coming from Africa, we often like to start with your background. I've listened to a lot of the stories, a lot of times in different interviews that you've brought, and you tend to mention that, you know, your father had written a poem, but I don't hear you talk much about your father, your parents, who they were. I know you were born in Chicago, but where were they coming from, and how did they influence you as a youth to be open to such a revolutionary movement like this?
Okay. Well, first I'll recommend that you read my book.
Well, we have it here, and I started, but I didn't get through,
because that whole thing is laid out in there. So,
okay, good.
Let me for the audience that's viewing today. I was born in 1950 on the south side of Chicago in a black hospital. I say black hospital because back then black people had to go to black hospitals. Cook County, which is no longer in existence. And my parents had grown up in the same neighborhood that Emmit Till was born into, there on the south side. My dad went to Inglewood High School. My mother's parents were from Mississippi.
Okay.
And my father's parents, and where my father was born, was in Kentucky, Henderson, Kentucky.
Okay.
And I think that's important as a backdrop, obviously, because of the Mississippi. My mother was born in 1925. She was not born in Mississippi, but Mississippi during that time was probably the most dangerous state in the United States at that point. Very dangerous
for blacks,
and for black people. And her parents, her father was dark complected. Her mother could pass for white. So they were an interesting little couple when you looked at them, because they looked like anybody that didn't know, because that was not an unusual occurrence in Mississippi, because the master would go tipping in the middle of the night.
Right.
Her mother had fallen in love with a white guy who was not from the United States. He was somewhere from Europe, but it was still taboo because mixed race couples were not allowed.
Yes.
And he ended up having to leave the country for his life.
Oh, wow.
And so she gave birth to my grandmother, but she died when my grandmother was 5 or 6 years old. And so she was raised by her grandmother, and my great-great-grandmother, who I knew, us kids knew. She was born somewhere around 1860. She would tell us stories when she was a little girl. She remembered people crying in the home when she was a little girl, and it was when Lincoln got shot. So she would give us those stories all the way back to the time Lincoln was assassinated. And that's important because black people have always had an oral tradition of passing on their legacies. So my mother grew up knowing that her father, my grandfather, when he was around 12 years old, they had to get him out of Mississippi for a brief time because he wasn't going to be one that was going to be shuffling and lowering his eyes. He would snap back at people. So they had to get him out of there for a brief time so that he wouldn't end up dead or lynched. That's how dangerous Mississippi was. And so she understood that. My father, on the other hand, was born in Kentucky, outside of Henderson, Kentucky. And his mother, the matriarch, she was not the matriarch, she was matriarch later, but his mother, my grandmother, was born in a town outside of Henderson, Kentucky, that bore the family's name.
Oh, okay.
It was called, and this land, they got after the Civil War. Her uncle and her grandfather, my grandmother's uncle and grandfather, had fought in the Civil War, and they were some of the few people that got the 40 acres and a mule. So Amanda Brooks, she was the matriarch at the time, my grandmother's mother, and they named the town Brookstown. And so it was a family town. They had their own store, they had their own livery stable, they had their own they had school, church, they had all the little things that a small town needed, and it was Brookstown. So that history, on my father's side was very rich and deep.
Yes.
So by the time they were part of both families were part of the migration north out of the South in the early 1900s. And by the time he was born in 24, my mother in 25, they had been part of that, or they knew that rich history. So by the time we were born, this was flowing through their veins. Now, I don't say or claim that my parents were activists, but they were aware.
Yes.
And we were living in Champaign, Illinois, just outside, where Champaign is.
Yep.
We had moved down there they had moved when I was about 2. They left me behind with my grandmother because my mother was pregnant with her next child, my youngest brother. And they had moved to Champaign, set up home, and then I later joined them.
Okay.
But in 55, when Emmit was murdered, my dad immediately reacted, as did the whole south side of Chicago and around. It was like the shot heard around the world, because it was really the pinnacle point that launched the civil rights movement. And so he wrote a poem, which is in the book.
Okay.
Now, of course, at 5 years old, I didn't know that he had written the poem. I didn't read it until years later. But that's kind of the backdrop. They always made sure that we were aware of what was going on. A lot of people, hid the truth from their kids.
Trying to protect them.
I suppose. By the time we moved to Seattle in 1957, I was a 7-year-old. The civil rights movement was blossoming. But you have to keep in mind, as a 7-year-old, I'm a kid, but when after school, get home, do your homework, one TV in the house, TV's on, we're going to watch the news together. So we saw Bloody Sunday in 63. We saw the massacre of the 3 bus riders that went down, the Freedom Riders that went down to demonstrate in Mississippi. We saw the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. We witnessed those things. It was not just that. And I often tell people that I grew up in an era of assassinations, because I remember the excitement in our home in 1960 around the election of John Kennedy. Because Kennedy was seen as a ray of hope, someone that was sympathetic to the civil rights movement. My parents, of course, voted for him. And I remember those things pretty vividly. When Adlai Stevenson ran and lost to Nixon or Eisenhower in 56, you just remember those things. The excitement around Kennedy, and then here he was assassinated 3 years later, following the Pettus Bridge, following the murder of the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, following the murder of Medgar Evers. It was all of these things were happening, one right after the other. I remember sitting and we were let go home from school. And I remember sitting, the next morning watching the TV, watching these events, and seeing Oswald being led out of the police station and watching him get murdered live on TV. These things were unfolding one right after the other. I remember sitting through the funeral. The whole thing is like vividly in my mind.
Yeah.
So, I forgot to mention earlier when you asked me to introduce myself. I'm a diversity consultant and have been a diversity consultant for the last 37 years, almost 38 years now. And I often tell my participants when I'm doing a training class, when we're looking at different values across generations, that there's a social psychologist by the name of Morris Massey who did a video called "You Are What You Were When," and what he meant by that is that the things that you are experiencing when you're in those years between 10 and 20, that those things would shape many of your values, which will come out later, but you don't know what's happening to you at the moment.
Right.
Those things will shape your values, and they'll stay with you for the rest of your life unless you have what he called a significant emotional experience. So while these things are happening around us, I'm still a kid.
Yeah.
I'm hanging out with my friends and doing kid stuff. Getting in a little bit of mischief here and there. So I'm still a kid, but those things are in the back of my head.
Yeah.
And somewhere down in there, and I did grow up in a melting pot neighborhood. Madrona. We lived directly across the street from Madrona Park, Madrona Place.
Okay.
And we moved to that home in 1960. And just before Kennedy was assassinated. And on that playground, the kids were Black, they were white, they were Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, rich and poor, because we lived on the boundary. We didn't know it at the time, but we lived on the boundary of the redlining.
Okay.
And so on the other side of, we were on 33rd, on the other side of 34th down to 35th, going towards the lake, that's where it was redlined. And my two best friends were white, lived across the street from one another in the area outside of the red line. So we didn't know that, but and so my interactions were with all of these different kids. I mean, I like I said, I grew up with kids from all of those different backgrounds.
Yeah.
And my parents had always made sure that we followed the creed that King put out, was that you judge a person by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin. They were always like that.
Yeah.
Even though my father had experienced, when he was a 17, about to become 18-year-old, when Pearl Harbor was bombed, and he and his buddies they had formed a little group called the Four Feathers, and they went down to sign up. They didn't wait to be drafted. Went to sign up because they wanted to defend the country. They wanted to defend democracy and defend the U.S. because we had been attacked by the Japanese. Now that's a whole nother story, of course.
Yeah.
But
another piece of Seattle history.
Well, Seattle history and U.S. history,
American history, definitely.
Because they had put the Japanese government into a box, and so people don't want to look at that piece of it, the imperialism of the U.S.
Yeah.
But anyway, so they signed up, and when he got his papers to report, the little town, and then at the end it had the initials MS, and he thought he was going to Missouri or someplace. I guess he didn't know his geography, or at least the how the well, as it turned out, his boot camp was in Mississippi.
Oh, all right.
And so he gets down there, and they are warned, because he's part of the infantry that he was assigned to, was the infantry that was featured in the movie Glory,
Okay.
Mm.
fighting 54th.
Mm-hmm.
It was the first all black infantry formed during the Civil War. He was in that exact same infantry.
Mm.
And so, because of that time, of course, black troops were separated from white troops.
Right.
And so when they got to basic training, the officers warned them not to leave the base when they got liberty. When you have a break, when your liberty comes, don't leave the base. Stay here and party. Well, they ignored that, and they went into the town, of course, and they got into fights.
Mm-hmm.
And before they got back on base,
Mm.
when it came time for them to leave for war, they're all very patriotic, and they're walking through the Mississippi town, and rather than confetti flying and flags flying, there was feces being thrown at them, insults, you niggers are cowards, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
That never colored how he saw people.
Mm.
Just some idiots, but that never colored how he saw other people. And there were a couple of other incidents that I won't spoil that are in my book.
Okay.
But growing up in that backdrop, both of my parents, they always made sure that we respected people for who they were.
Mm.
And that was very important. They exposed us to their friends, because my dad was very outgoing, and people loved him.
Mm.
So he had friends that he had made that were Jewish. We went over Jewish families' homes and had Passover over their house. He had friends that were Scandinavian, and he and my mom, they'd have them come over every now and then. They'd come over on a Friday night after we had polished the floors to me and my brothers on our hands and knees, polished the floors to a bright shine. While we were polishing the floors, my dad was playing in the background. He was playing La Boheme and Madame Butterfly, because my dad was an opera lover. So we grew up loving opera. It was just kind of kids, and there it is. And he's up there conducting while we're on the hands and knees. Don't forget that spot, that kind of thing.
Uh-huh.
When the Scandinavian people came in, we rolled back the carpets, moved all the furniture back, and they were doing loud Scandinavian dancing on the floors. So I mean,
so you had a very rich upbringing.
We experienced all these different cultures.
Mm-hmm.
So, like you had said earlier, Seattle, when you think of Seattle's black community, it was pretty much insulated and isolated.
Mm-hmm.
It trickled down south, because down in Holly Park, where there's a housing project, yes, Rainier Vista, a housing project, right. Even over in High Point, blacks there because that's where they could live. Mm-hmm. But pretty much the CD, and then down that corridor down into the south side. Mm-hmm. But other than that, like you said, Seattle was primarily white, and then all of these other cultures mixed in.
Right.
But I grew up with this kind of multicultural focus, and that, as it turned out, would serve me well when we got into the Black Panther Party, because the Black Panther Party had a multicultural agenda. Right. While we focused on the needs of black people, that allowed us to build this Rainbow Coalition. That was the phrase Rainbow Coalition was coined by Deputy Chairman Fred Hampton.
Right.
Not by Jesse Jackson.
Right. Thank you.
Quick question. When you were talking about the cultural diversity that you grew up with, as far as like the rainbow of people that you were associated with, your family introduced you all to, so you did have this world view or broader perspective of just the isolation that you may have had growing up anywhere else in the world, especially in America, because like here in Chicago, the experiences that you're sharing, I look to like my fathers, my aunties, and their experiences nowhere near that notion of cultural diversity. There is so much segregation, even to this day, in a metropolitan area, where you don't get to oftentimes experience that until you travel, until you go somewhere else, you get that exposure. So I think that may have influence like your father, and having this treat people the way you want to be treated, judge everyone for the way of their character. Did this have any sort of influence on his perhaps political perspective, given the way that Black people as a collective were treated by society? Um,
Well, you have to keep in mind, he did not grow up in a multicultural environment.
Right.
He grew up on the south side of Chicago,
mhm,
went to Inglewood High School.
Mm-hmm.
So he had that same, as my mother did, insulated in the segregated Black community in Chicago that everybody else did.
Right.
mhm,
For some reason, and I don't know, I don't know what that reason is. He looked beyond that.
Yeah.
mhm,
I think one of the things that probably was an influence in him that allowed him to look beyond, while he was very aware of what was going on to Black folks, through his parents and because of his growing up on the south side of Chicago. But he was an artist.
Okay.
He wanted to be an artist. In fact, he went to and graduated from the Chicago Art Institute.
Oh, wow.
Artists have a way of seeing the world in a different lens.
Mm-hmm.
And even though he grew up in that segregated South Side Chicago, my mother and my father, I guess, at different stages of their life, would listen to the radio broadcasts that would come out of the Empire. I don't know if you know where the Empire Room is.
Mm-mm.
The Empire Room is it's a green room in the fancy hotel in downtown Chicago, the Palmer House. And there was a broadcast on Saturday nights live from the Empire Room in the Palmer House, jazz show.
Okay.
Billie Holiday, Duke Ellington,
Mm-hmm.
all of the jazz greats.
Okay.
And they would perform in the Empire Room, in the green room, but they couldn't stay there.
Uh-huh.
They couldn't eat there.
Mm-hmm.
My mother had never been to inside the Palmer House. And so years later, when I was a diversity consultant, I had clients all over Chicago. This was back in the 90s, late 90s, early 2000s. One of my clients would put me up in the Palmer House.
Mm.
And I called, my mother was visiting one year, and I said, guess where I'm at?
Made it, bro.
Well, no, her and my aunt, my father's sister, because at this point my dad was deceased.
Mm.
Her and my aunt, my father's sister, said, we coming.
Uh-huh.
They came down. They wanted to see the rooms. I took them down to the Empire Room. They had never seen the inside of that.
Mm.
And so my parents grew up in that segregated environment, but my father, have an artistic mind.
Yeah.
Artists tend to see the world in colors.
Right.
And I think that was part of what allowed him to mentally escape
Right.
the segregation of the South Side of Chicago.
Yeah. Have a vision for something bigger.
Have a vision for something bigger. He also was stationed for a brief time in Hawaii.
Okay.
On his way to the South Pacific, and saw the people in Hawaii who are of different shades from a different culture.
Mm-hmm.
So who knows? Those are some of the influences that allowed him to see beyond. And he knew that he wasn't sure what he was going to get when he got to Seattle, because he was given the opportunity to work for Boeing. That's what brought a lot of Black people to Seattle.
Right.
But when he got here, it was this rainbow of people.
Yeah.
And what better place for him to be and to raise his kids in an environment where they were not confined by just the environment in the Black community. So it's kind of the way things just kind of unfolded and happened.
I see. And I always like to start that way, because you can see where the historian in you is coming from with your great grandma. You can see where the visionary is coming from with your father. You can see where the multiculturalism is coming from with your parents and your upbringing. And that experience that you were an exposure you're getting between 10 and 20, like you said.
Yep.
And that's the phase of your life that you met the Black Panther Party, right? Can you
Yep.
tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, today they call it you're being awoke. You're whatever it is that supposedly wakes you up, right?
Mhm.
Because I think that in those early years that we probably are in some sort of a almost kind of a make-believe world. My grandmother on my mother's side, the one who passed for white in the 1930s,
Right, who passed away early, right?
so that her and my grandfather were able to buy a house because she could work in the downtown fancy restaurants while he was working on the railroad.
Mm-hmm.
And the fancy restaurant that she worked in downtown, the doctors and the lawyers came to, and they would always give her tips, and she saw the life that they lived. So she had kind of picked out professions that we were going to have. For some reason, she said that Aaron, I know why she chose this for Aaron, because Aaron was always mild mannered.
Oh, okay.
He was always even keel.
Oh.
So she told him he was going to be a preacher.
Oh, wow.
Now, for me, I was her favorite because I had stayed with her when I was 2 years old while the rest of the family moved.
Mm-hmm.
And so she told me I was going to be a doctor.
Mm-hmm.
Not only did she tell me I was going to be a doctor, she told me, she said, and don't get married, and you'll be a rich playboy. So while I'm growing up, this is kind of, okay, this is my dream here. Right? Bubble that you
sounds good to me, Grandma.
You have this bubble that you kind of live in.
Mm-hmm.
And so in 1967, this was at the point where the Black Power movement was emerging.
Mm-hmm.
A guy by the name of Stokely Carmichael came to Seattle.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Stokely Carmichael at that point was the national spokesperson or chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC.
Mm-hmm.
His predecessor was H. Rap Brown,
mm-hmm.
who was very volatile and outspoken. In fact, there's a famous poster of H. Rap holding a match, and underneath the caption reads, "Burn, baby, burn."
Mm-hmm.
That was during the Watts Rebellion and the rebellions in Detroit. And Stokely was the first one who said in public, what we need is Black Power.
Mm-hmm.
Because he was working with King in the South, and he was seeing what was going on with the movement, and he said, but what we need is Black Power. He was the first one to say that in public, but someone else had said it, but he heard it and said it.
Mm-hmm.
So when he comes to Seattle, all the young Black people went down to Garfield. I was going to Garfield at the time.
Okay.
And those of us that could crowd into the gymnasium did. It was an overflow crowd outside with speakers. And I remember listening to him, and he was telling us the reason why Black people don't have freedom is because you hate yourself.
Mm.
You hate the fact that you're Black. And he talked about all these analogies, which you've heard, the good cowboy wears white, the bad cowboy wears black. The good knight rides a white horse, the bad knight rides a black horse. Angel food cake is white, devil's food cake is black. He made all these analogies. And while I'm sitting there, I kind of thought that he was talking about black against white, which he wasn't.
Right.
He was talking about loving yourself.
Right. Yourself
identity. And so as I thought about it, I remembered that on the playground, right across the street where we grew up, that if someone dared call me Black, those were fighting words. Black, I ain't Black, and there was the realization that I had been, lied, confused, hoodwinked.
Yeah, given that self-hate.
All of those things. And that was, we didn't call it a woke moment back then. We called it, getting political consciousness.
Okay.
And so that's where my political consciousness was born, as a 17-year-old, listening to Stokely Carmichael and thinking about it days after. So I went and joined SNCC, and I became one of the co-chairs of the Seattle chapter of SNCC
in high school.
Yeah, I was like I said, I was about to entering into my senior year as a 17-year-old at Garfield, and we were doing stuff like voter registration because that's what they did. That was what we do. Well, what do you do? Well, okay, voter registration, right? Because the '68 election would be coming up the next year, and of course there was this dude that we had heard about before, Richard Nixon, that we knew would be running, so we had to do some voter registration. Well, along the way, we me and my buddies decided we wanted the Black Student Union. So we started the first or second, there's some dispute about whether it was the first or second, high school Black Student Union on the West Coast of the United States. It was certainly the first one in Seattle, certainly the first one in the Northwest. So it was and we had to, in order to get the BSU approved, because we said we want this as an organization. The principal said no. He said, you have a boys club, which later was changed to the men's club, but still we said that don't represent us. So we had to do several things along the way. I played in the jazz band, also known as the stage band. So on the pep assemblies, we were down on the floor. I was down on the floor with 8 or other 10 people, because it was a small band that played for the pep assemblies. So I was kind of the focal point. So when it came time to play the national anthem, I refused to play and I sat down. And my comrades in the audience sat down and wouldn't stand up. So of course, me being down in front where I'm visible to everyone, I get kicked out of school. So my parents had to bring me back up, and my dad first. And so Mr. Pucci, the band director, said, if you're going to be in the band, you got to play. So I said, fine. So the next rep assembly, I played the national anthem, but I played it sitting down. So I got kicked out of school again. So my mother had to bring me back up that time because they alternated. And the vice principal said, Mrs. Dixon, can't you make him just stop? And Mrs. Dixon said, my mother said, I can't make him do anything. So because that time, I was developing who I would become.
Yes.
And so the next assembly, we took a different tactic. So after the national anthem was played, I started the chant, and they were my echo in the audience. I said, bing, bing. And they said, bing, bing. I said, bang, bang. They said, bang, bang. I said, Ungawa. They said, Ungawa, Black Power. And the whole student body erupted. Of course, I get kicked out of school again.
I'm surprised you didn't get expelled at that one.
This is 50 years before Colin Kaepernick, by the way.
Right.
And so we decided, we went down to the school district office, and we had this little short sister that was with us. She was very light complected, boy, but she was a firebrand. And she was shaking her finger in that superintendent of public instruction's face, and he said, I can't do that. It's up to the principal. So we decided we were going to call an all-school boycott. And the word must have got out. And the administration didn't do anything or take action, because they thought, so it'd be a handful of Black kids that don't go to class, and we'll just kick them out and we'll have the problem solved. What they did not realize was that all of those white students, Black students, Latino students, Asian students, we all went to school together, grade school, junior high school, because it's called junior high back then. So when we called the all-school boycott, nobody went to class except for a few honor students. And we were, the hallway was jammed in front of the principal's office, and he threw the white flag out. Said, you guys can have a BSU. That's how we got our BSU. Oh wow! So that was really the beginning of my activism. Was figuring out how we could organize and act and disrupt things and speak our mind. And so I ended up getting arrested a couple of times and going to juvie. And one I'll tell you about here in a minute because it's pivotal in terms of how this whole thing led to us going to San Francisco and meeting Bobby Seale.
Mm-hmm.
There was a sister high school, which you know, called Franklin High School
Mm-hmm.
on the South End, and they called us up. And my brother, by the way, Aaron, was out at the UW with Larry Gossett, Carl Miller, and E.J. Briscoe. They had started the BSU there at the UW.
Mm-hmm.
And so we got a call, and the brothers from Franklin said that, you know, a sister got kicked out of school because she was wearing an afro. Black students and white students, if they got in a fight, the black student would be expelled, the white student sent back to class.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, we need help. We want to BSU. So Larry and Carl and Aaron and me and a couple other brothers, we went down to Franklin. And we're sitting in the beanery. I don't know if you know where the beanery was. The beanery was a little, right? So we're sitting in the beanery, and they're telling what was going on, and you know, and they needed representation at BSU. And so Larry said, "So what y'all want to do? Are you ready?" And they said, "Yeah, we're ready." So we marched across the street, went up into the principal's office, and said, "Get out!" Kicked the principal out, vice principal out, kicked all the secretaries out. We said, "We're taking over the school." Kicked them all out. We took over the school. And we stayed there when school was over, and we stayed overnight. And the next morning, the phone rang. We answered the phone. Franklin High School, how can I help you? Well, it was the principal, and the principal said they can have a BSU, they can have a Black Studies program. Please leave my office.
Wow!
So victory, right? We had achieved our goal, and so we left. Well, a few days later, I'm back at Garfield in my second period class, geometry, whatever it was. Phone rings. And Mr. Naramore said, "Elmer, they want you in the office." I'm thinking, again? Okay, what did I do now?
Mm-hmm.
I left my book and stepped out of the office. And as soon as I stepped out, there were two detectives there who read me my rights, handcuffed me, and quietly took me out of the back door to juvie, take me to juvie. And they had arrested another brother who had gone with us on the other side of the school. He was being arrested. And we got to juvie, and while we were being arrested, simultaneously, Aaron, Larry, Carl Miller were being arrested out at the UW.
Mm-hmm.
They were, of course, taken to jail.
Right.
But we were underage. They took us to juvie.
Mm-hmm.
I get into juvie, and the second I get in there, I see this commotion over on the TV. And so I go over to see what's going on. Well, King had been assassinated.
Oh, wow.
And so it was almost as if they knew, get us off the street so that they don't cause chaos here in Seattle.
Right.
And because we were arrested within seconds. It must have been minutes that he was assassinated.
Wow.
That we were arrested, because we hadn't heard anything until I got into juvie. And so that night, later that evening, when my parents came to pick me up, you know, we drove home in silence, because we had marched with King when he came to Seattle in 2011 when I was, in 61 when I was 11 years old. And so they were very solemn, you know, it was like a dark cloud over the country, and cities had been burning. And I can only imagine what they must have been thinking. On the same day, that night, the King was dead.
Yeah.
Their two oldest sons were in jail or jail.
Right.
What the hell was going on? But my dad just said, "Are you all right?" And I said, "I'm fine." So we drove home in silence. Now, a week later, we had already been planning to drive to San Francisco to attend the West Coast Conference of Black Student Unions.
Now, that's just you and your brothers, or that's your parents as well?
No, not my parents. This was members of the BSU, both at the UW, both at Garfield, some of the ones brothers and sisters at Franklin.
Okay.
And so we went down in car caravans drove down to San Francisco State. I had to get permission to leave.
So are your parents supportive at this point because of all of the challenges that they were having, say with you standing or sitting in the band and not refusing?
Yeah. You know, my parents knew that
They couldn't stop.
There was nothing about changing my or my brother's minds. Nothing.
And they weren't trying to persuade you to comply or to just
No,
okay.
because they knew that was useless at that point.
Mm-hmm.
We were going to do what we were going to do.
Mm-hmm.
They had never tried to control our minds
Mm-hmm.
or control. They knew that we were. I got my first job when I was 12 years old because I didn't like the shoes that my mother bought me for school, and she said, "If you don't like them, buy your own."
All right. And you're
So,
like, yep.
So I got my job and went and bought my own shoes.
I see.
I bought my first moped when I was 15 because I got a job at the grocery store sweeping floors.
Mm-hmm.
So they raised us to be independent.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so by this time, there was nothing that they were going to be able to say or do.
Yeah.
And they didn't try.
Yeah.
They were just there to support whatever decisions that we made. And so they're always very supportive.
Nice.
But at that point, you have to realize that, see, people don't understand when they look back at history and they look at now and they look at then. It was a very different time back then.
Yes.
Sure.
Very different time. We were on the precipice of a new movement,
Mm-hmm.
of a revolution.
Mm-hmm.
As young people were fed up with the civil rights movement and the lack of gains that were being made, and here then you murder the Prince of Peace.
Mm-hmm.
So we were gonna do what we needed to do to get done to change the dynamic, to shift the dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
Because the rise of Black power, the rise of Black consciousness, all of this now had been bubbling to the surface in the mid 60s, after the murder of Malcolm X.
Uh-huh.
People began to, the consciousness was building. And so we were caught up in that rise of Black consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
So we get down to San Francisco, and first time been in California, the Bay Area, that's like the Mecca of change, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Hippies everywhere, would-be revolutionaries, armchair revolutionaries, it's all there.
Mm-hmm.
And of course on the East Coast, New York is the same way, Chicago's the same way, but here on the West Coast, it's the Bay Area.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had never experienced anything like that, coming out of Seattle.
Right.
And so we go to get to the conference, and that night, as a surprise to us, the keynote speaker was none other than Chairman Bobby Seale of the Black Panther Party.
Mm-hmm.
And he's up there, he's flanked by 2 bodyguards, one who was on a crutch because he had been wounded in the shootout that had just occurred days earlier that we didn't know anything about. And Bobby was mad. And I never like to describe members of the Black Panther Party as mad, because one of the misconceptions is that we were angry Black men or women.
Mm-hmm.
That we were organized out of hate and out of anger. No,
Mm-hmm.
we organized out of love for the community and love for humanity.
Mm-hmm.
But at this particular point, he was mad because 2 days after MLK was assassinated, the first member to join the Black Panther Party, his close friend, little Bobby Hutton,
Mm-hmm.
who had joined when he was 16, was brutally murdered at the hands of police in the streets of Oakland. Chairman Bobby says today, when I talked to Bobby, I was talking to Bobby often. He's kind of fallen off a little bit in his health, but he said that he says that little Bobby was in police custody, which technically he was, because what had happened was that following an incident where they were planning for this big Free Huey rally, and some brothers in the party decided they were going to get a get back for the murder of Malcolm, and it fired on some pigs, and then the pigs, of course, vamped and everybody dispersed. Well, little Bobby and Eldridge Cleaver found themselves trapped in the basement of a house, and the police, of course, surrounded and were just firing into the house. There At one point, they set the house on fire. Tear gas was everywhere. And Eldridge told little Bobby, all right, strip down naked because we got to get out. We got to surrender. And little Bobby wasn't going to strip down naked. He said, I'll go down to my skivvies, but I ain't going naked. Eldridge knew what would happen. And so when they came out of the house, they saw that Eldridge was naked. So they couldn't say he had a gun because he was totally naked. And they just started beating him. He'd also been wounded in the leg. Little Bobby had his skivvies on. And tear gas was in his eyes. And they pushed him forward. And someone said, he's got a gun. Wow. And they just opened up on him. So Chairman Bobby was mad. He was infuriated. And he gave the most fiery speech that I'd ever heard. And following his speech, you could almost see a line drawn in the sand. I remember him saying, we're going to fight this revolution till our blood runs in the streets. And so the line in the sand was 90% of those students that were scared to death, including some of the people that were with us. Aaron and I made a beeline to Chairman Bobby. And we said, we want to start a chapter. We're from Seattle. We want to start a chapter of the Black Panther Party. So he invited us to come to little Bobby's funeral the next day. He said, we'll make sure that you get a seat, because he wanted us to see what we were getting into.
Right.
Sure.
And little Bobby's murder was like a striking point, because people had joined the party in waves overnight in the Bay Area. So by the time we the next morning, we drive across the Bay Bridge down into West Oakland, we started seeing, it seemed like hundreds of young black men and women in leather jackets and berets, some of them in military formation. And to me, it looked like a black army. I've never seen that many black people in one place, let alone dressed like a revolutionary army. And when we got into the church, there were Panthers on the walls, and down in front was little Bobby's coffin draped in a Panther flag. And so, he reserved, so we had some seats up front. And we went listened to the whole program, and after the eulogy, and Mrs. Hutton. Now, keep in mind, little Bobby had been hit by 20 or some police bullets, but she wanted the coffin to be open, like Meniooh Till. The community could see what they had done to her son.
Right. So
when it came time to walk past the coffin, I remember looking in. And this is an image that'll never, forever be burned in the images in my mind. As there's little Bobby, dressed in a leather jacket, a Free Huey button, powder blue shirt, the uniform of the Black Panther Party, and a beret. And as I looked at him, I realized that he was 17 years old and I was 17 years old. And I said, that could be me lying there. That was the point. Of no return.
Yeah.
That was it. I knew I was ready to die for the revolution.
On the sunny side of the street,